A king needs silver to pay his army. A banker controls the only mine that produces it. The loan contract does not ask for repayment. It asks for the mine itself. This is not a metaphor. This is how one man became more powerful than the monarchs who borrowed from him. And the contract that did it is still sitting in an archive. His name was Jakob Fugger, born in 1459 as the 10th child of a cloth merchant in the German city of Augsburg. No title, no army, no royal blood. By the time he died, he had financed popes, purchased an emperor, and controlled the flow of silver and copper across an entire continent. His personal fortune equaled roughly 2% of Europe's total economic output. Not 2% of one kingdom, 2% of Europe. Historians argue about who was the richest person in history. Some point to Mansa Musa and his legendary gold. Others cite Augustus Caesar and the treasury of Rome. The comparisons break down across eras and economic systems. But within his own world, Fugger's leverage was unprecedented. He didn't just accumulate wealth, he built a machine that converted credit into permanent control. This sounds like an exaggeration. It isn't. Here's the mechanism. In the late 15th century, the Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol controlled the richest silver mines in Europe, a region called Schwaz, known then as the mother of all mines. At its peak, Schwaz produced half of all the silver in the Holy Roman Empire. Miners worked thousands of meters of tunnels carved into the Austrian Alps. The silver that came out of those mountains paid for armies, built cathedrals, and financed the ambitions of princes across the continent. Sigismund controlled this treasure, but Sigismund had a problem. He spent recklessly. He ran up debts to fund wars against Venice, court expenses, personal indulgences. He owed money to Italian bankers. He owed money to local merchants. He owed money to everyone. And his creditors were getting impatient. Jakob Fugger saw an opportunity. In 1485, Fugger made his first loan to Sigismund, 3,000 florins. A small amount. A test. But Fugger wasn't interested in collecting interest. Interest was technically illegal under church law. What Fugger wanted was access. He offered to pay off Sigismund's debts directly. He covered the wages of court workers. He paid 100,000 guilders in war reparations to Venice on behalf of the Archduke. And in return, Fugger demanded something that looked boring on paper, but wasn't boring at all. He demanded the right to purchase silver from the Schwaz mines at a fixed price, far below market value. Here's why that matters. The market price of silver in Venice or Antwerp was 8 guilders per unit. Fugger's contract locked in a purchase price of 5 guilders. Every time the mine produced, Fugger collected the spread, 3 guilders per unit, automatically, regardless of whether Sigismund paid back the original loan or not. Repayment didn't depend on a king's promise. It depended on who controlled the mine gate. This clause looks boring. It isn't. This is where kings lose leverage. By 1487, Fugger had invested over 23,000 florins in Tyrolean mining operations. He bought shares in smelting companies, and he financed the construction of new tunnels. He inserted himself into every stage of production, from extraction to sale. With each loan, Sigismund sank deeper into dependence. By 1488, the Archduke owed Fugger over 150,000 guilders. The Tyrolean estates, the local nobles who advised the Archduke, began to panic. They saw their silver revenues flowing to Augsburg rather than into local treasuries, and they pressured Sigismund to act. In March 1490, Sigismund was forced to abdicate. He surrendered his lands to his nephew, a young Habsburg prince named Maximilian. Maximilian inherited the debt. This is where things get interesting. Maximilian did not resent Fugger. He recognized him. He understood that Fugger was not just a creditor, he was infrastructure. Fugger was the only man in Europe who could move large sums of money across borders, convert currencies, and deliver capital on demand. Maximilian was ambitious. He wanted to expand Habsburg power through marriages and diplomacy. That cost money, and Fugger was the only source large enough to fund it. In 1489, the two had met at a trade fair in Frankfurt. That meeting started one of the most consequential business relationships in European history. Fugger would finance Maximilian's wars, his marriages, his diplomacy. He paid for the weddings that brought Spain, Hungary, and Bohemia into the Habsburg orbit. In return, Maximilian would grant Fugger mining rights, land, and eventually a noble title. In 1511, Maximilian elevated Fugger to the nobility of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1514, he made him an imperial count. A cloth merchant's son could now deal with kings as one of their own. But Fugger didn't stop at silver. He wanted copper too. In 1494, he formed a partnership with a Hungarian engineer named Hans Thurzo. Thurzo had technical expertise and connections to the Hungarian royal court. Fugger had capital, and together they built the largest copper operation in Europe. The center of this operation was a town called Banska Bystrica in what is now Slovakia. Thurzo introduced new vertical mining techniques that allowed extraction from deeper deposits. Fugger financed the construction of furnaces, roads, and warehouses. They built trade routes stretching from the mountains to ports on the Baltic Sea and the Adriatic. Copper flowed to Gdansk, to Lubeck, to Venice. Some was shipped to Antwerp. Some was loaded onto Portuguese vessels in Lisbon and carried to India in exchange for spices. Archaeologists have found Fugger-marked copper ingots in a Portuguese shipwreck off the coast of Namibia, cargo from a vessel that sank in 1533 on its way to Asia. That is evidence of how far the family's metals network reached. Within a decade, the Fugger-Thurzo company became one of Europe's dominant copper suppliers. Their output was large enough that major buyers had few practical alternatives. If you wanted bronze for cannons or brass for scientific instruments, you dealt with Fugger. This was not wealth in the modern sense. This was chokepoint control. And Fugger understood something that most merchants did not. He understood that the edge was not higher interest rates. The edge was timing. He built an information network that moved faster than any competitor. His agents in Antwerp knew prices in Venice before local traders did. His couriers carried coded letters across the Alps. He tracked shipments, inventories, and market conditions in real time, as close to real time as the 16th century allowed. He knew when a cargo would arrive before the buyer did, and he used that knowledge to set terms no one else could match. No soldiers, no threats, just a switch that controlled revenue. By the early 1500s, Fugger's reach extended beyond mines and monarchs. It reached the Vatican itself. Pope Leo X had a problem. He wanted to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a monument to the glory of the church. The project was massive. The old basilica, built over the tomb of St. Peter, had stood for over 1,000 years. Leo wanted something grander, something that would declare the permanence and power of the Catholic Church. But the church did not have enough gold. Contemporary accounts describe papal household costs in the hundreds of thousands of ducats each year, with debts mounting even higher. So the Pope turned to bankers. And the largest banker in Europe was Jakob Fugger. Fugger had been moving money for the church since the 1470s, transferring revenues from distant parishes in Sweden and Poland to Rome. Now, he lent directly. And to repay him, the church turned to a controversial practice, the sale of indulgences. Here is where the machinery gets complicated. An indulgence was a document you could buy to reduce your punishment for sins. The church had sold them before, usually to fund specific projects like crusades or cathedral construction. But now the sales became systematic. Archbishop Albrecht of Brandenburg had a problem of his own. He wanted to hold 3 bishoprics at the same time, which violated church law. To get a special dispensation from the Pope, he needed to pay a fee, a large fee. He did not have the money, so he borrowed it from Fugger, 21,000 guilders. To repay Fugger, the Pope authorized a special indulgence sale in Albrecht's territories. The terms were explicit. Half the revenue went to Rome for St. Peter's, The other half went directly to Fugger to settle Albrecht's debt. A preacher named Johann Tetzel traveled from town to town in Germany, promising that the coins dropped in his chest would free souls from purgatory. A jingle later attributed to Tetzel captured the pitch. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Here is what most people did not know. A Fugger agent accompanied Tetzel at all times. The agent held a key to the indulgence chest. When the chest was full, he opened it and divided the contents. Half for the Pope, half for Augsburg. To the Church, this was funding for a sacred project. To Fugger, it was accounts receivable. Under the agreed revenue split, Fugger was taking a 50% cut. A young monk named Martin Luther watched this happen. He saw money flowing out of German towns and into the hands of bankers and popes, while ordinary people struggled. In October 1517, he wrote his famous 95 Theses, a list of criticisms aimed at church corruption. Many of those complaints were about indulgences. Luther probably did not know the exact terms of the Fugger and Albrecht deal, but he sensed the machinery. The following year, when Luther was summoned to answer for his writings, the interrogation took place in the Fugger house in Augsburg. The banker's home had become the stage for a confrontation that would reshape Christianity. Luther's protest helped ignite the Protestant Reformation, one of the most consequential religious shifts in Western history. Millions would leave the Catholic Church. Wars would be fought. The map of Europe would be redrawn. The Reformation had many causes: theological disputes, political rivalries, national resentments. But one accelerant was financial machinery, loans, indulgence revenue, and the visible flow of German money to Rome. Was this modernization or a private monopoly capturing public power? The debate continues. If you have a view on which it was, the comments are open. But Fugger's greatest demonstration of power was still ahead. In January 1519, Emperor Maximilian died. The throne of the Holy Roman Empire was up for election. This was not a hereditary monarchy. The emperor was chosen by 7 electors, 3 archbishops and 4 secular princes, and their votes could be influenced. 4 candidates stepped forward: Charles of Habsburg, the young king of Spain and Maximilian's grandson; Francis, the king of France; Henry, the king of England; and Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, who was offered the crown by some who wanted a compromise candidate. Francis of France moved first. He offered 300,000 guilders in bribes. He secured preliminary commitments from the Archbishop of Trier and the Count Palatine of the Rhine. His ambassadors promised annual pensions, marriage alliances, and territorial concessions. Charles had almost no cash of his own. His Spanish treasury was depleted. His advisors were desperate. So they turned to Jakob Fugger. Fugger saw the opportunity clearly. A Habsburg emperor would protect his monopolies, enforce his contracts, and expand his access to new markets. A French emperor might not. The choice was simple. Fugger raised over 850,000 guilders for Charles's campaign, more than double what Francis offered. Of that total, Fugger personally contributed over 540,000. The Welser family, another Augsburg merchant house, contributed around 150,000. Italian bankers provided the rest. The bribes were structured carefully. The Archbishop of Mainz received direct payments and promises of future patronage. The Margrave of Brandenburg was promised an annual pension of 4,000 florins for life. The Archbishop of Cologne received similar terms. Marriage alliances were negotiated. Territorial disputes were quietly settled. Only one elector refused. Frederick of Saxony, known as Frederick the Wise, rejected all bribes from both sides. He was even offered the crown himself. He declined, citing his age and the burdens of empire. Charles paid him only an existing debt owed since 1497. On June 28, 1519, the 7 electors cast their votes in Frankfurt. Charles won 6 of 7. He was elected Holy Roman Emperor at the age of 19. He would rule over Spain, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, much of Italy, and the growing empire in the Americas. It was the largest realm in Europe since Charlemagne, and he owed it to a banker from Augsburg. Fugger knew it, and he made sure Charles knew it too. In 1523, the Imperial Diet in Nuremberg proposed new laws to limit the power of large merchant companies, monopolies like Fugger's. German princes complained that the great trading houses charged excessive prices and stifled competition. Luther himself had written against merchant monopolies. The political pressure was real. Charles hesitated. Then Fugger sent him a letter. The letter is preserved in archives. It reads in part, "It is well known that your imperial majesty could not have claimed the Roman crown without my help." That is not a polite reminder. That is a statement of leverage, a banker telling an emperor who made him. The anti-monopoly laws were never passed. Fugger kept his mining rights, and Charles granted him additional concessions in Spain, including mercury mines critical for silver processing that the Fugger Company would hold until 1645, more than a century after Jakob's death. Was this financial genius, or a structural flaw in monarchy that allowed private capital to capture public power? The question still echoes. If you know of another moment in history where this pattern appears, drop it in the comments. But Fugger did not only extract, he also built. In 1521, he founded something that still exists today, a social housing complex in Augsburg called the Fuggerei. Fuggerei. The Fuggerei consists of 67 buildings containing 142 apartments. It was designed to house poor Catholic citizens of Augsburg who had fallen on hard times through no fault of their own. Widows, elderly craftsmen, families displaced by illness or misfortune. The rent was set at 1 Rhenish guilder per year. That amount, unchanged since 1521, translates to 88 euro cents in today's currency. A symbolic sum. The real payment is the prayers. The rent has never changed. To qualify, you must be Catholic, a resident of Augsburg for at least 2 years, debt-free, and demonstrably in need. You must also agree to pray 3 times daily for the soul of Jakob Fugger and his family. The Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, the Apostles' Creed. Your prayers are the true rent. The Fuggerei is still administered by the Fugger Family Foundation. It has operated continuously for over 500 years, through the 30 Years' War, through plagues, through the near-total destruction of Augsburg in World War II. In 1944, Allied bombing destroyed 70% of the complex. It was rebuilt. The same street plan, the same rules, the same rent. Today, approximately 150 people live in the Fuggerei. The wait list runs 2 to 5 years. And here is an irony that captures something essential about the place. Admission to tour the Fuggerei costs 8 euros. That is 9 times the annual rent. Irony. There is something strange in that contrast. A man who extracted wealth from mines and monarchs also endowed the oldest social housing project in continuous operation anywhere in the world. A system that took also gave permanence. Perhaps that was the point. Fugger understood legacy. He built a chapel in the Church of St. Anna in Augsburg that became Germany's first Renaissance building. He commissioned artists like Albrecht Dürer. He wanted to be remembered not just as rich, but as noble, cultured, permanent. His nephew, Anton, doubled the family fortune after Jakob's death. Anton expanded trade routes into the Americas and married his children into noble families across Europe. He called himself the Prince of Merchants, but he also watched the system begin to strain. Spanish silver flooded in from the New World in quantities no one had anticipated. Prices rose. The careful monopolies his uncle had built began to erode. The Fugger Company survived, but never again dominated as it once had. Anton is credited with a phrase that captured the family's later philosophy. Nothing under the sun is eternal. Jakob Fugger died on December 30th, 1525. The official inventory of his estate, completed 2 years later, documented company assets on the order of 2 million guilders, counted, audited, precise to the last coin. 2 million. He was buried in the chapel he had built, a Catholic space inside what later became a Protestant church. The Fugger Foundation still maintains it, a strange monument to a man who funded the Pope and inadvertently helped spark the movement that tore the church apart. Why do so few people know this story? Fugger was not a king. He did not fight battles or lead armies. He wore no crown. He was a banker, a negotiator, a builder of systems. Protestants resented him for funding the Pope. Catholics distrusted him when he became more powerful than the church itself. Some polemics of the age portrayed him as a villain. His name became associated with greed. In time, his story was pushed aside. It is easier to remember the monarchs who stood in the spotlight than the financier who stood behind them. But maybe that is exactly the lesson. The mechanisms that shaped Europe were not always visible. They were contracts, collateral, ledgers, the power to say yes or no to a loan at the moment a king needed it most. Fugger did not hide. He wrote a letter to the emperor who had made him. That letter survives. The chapel survives. The Fuggerei survives. The pattern survives. Credit converts into leverage, and leverage converts into control. Control outlasts the men who borrowed. When the resource changes, the collateral changes. The mechanism does not. This architecture does not disappear. It adapts. In the industrial age, a new generation of families built empires not from silver mines, but from steel mills and rail lines. They used the same structure, credit, collateral, chokepoint control. Different resources, same pattern. That is where this story continues.